name is Sheena Campbell, and I'm a Student Services Librarian here at the Shields Library, where I liaise with students from the College of Biological Sciences and the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. I've been asked to make some recommendations for Women's History Month, so I hope you'll enjoy my list of recommendations. Being a librarian, I of course have to have a theme within a theme, so we'll see if you can catch them. My first recommendation is Circe by Madeline Miller. This is the story of Circe, who is the daughter of Helios, the sun god. And her power doesn't come from her divine bloodline, but rather it comes from her power to practice pharmaca, which is the divining of herbs and the ways in which they can be combined to make magic and her spells. So if you love Greek mythology, you'll really appreciate getting this alternative perspective on a lot of the stories that Circe is involved in, like the Odyssey, wherein she is the witch of Aiaia, where Odysseus lands and she transforms his crew into pigs. But she also participates in the story of the Minotaur, as well as the creation of the monster Scylla. And even if you don't know Greek mythology, this is a fantastic story about, it's a story of finding yourself, finding your power, and also in the desire to cultivate your own power, thinking about how you balance that with a desire to retain empathy and compassion for others. And that's really what makes Circe unique, is that she does search for how to walk this line of ambition, but also having a respect for the life of those around her. My next recommendation is Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. And I, as a historian, absolutely love the methodology of this book, which does a fantastic job of weaving together empirical evidence and primary texts from art and literature, as well as the archival record. It's Silvia Federici's examination of the transition in early modern Europe from feudalism to capitalism. And it's particularly interesting because she takes as her subject witch hunts in this period, and how we typically had seen them as being this sort of like last dying gasp of a sort of ignorant, mud-covered peasants being driven by ignorance. And what she argues is that it's not actually, that it's largely a result of in coming under a capitalist system where we're moving towards industrialization and privatization, that the labor of women who would engage in herb lore and being able to forage in the forests for mushrooms or for herbs to make tinctures, how there's really no place for this type of labor in a capitalist system. It's seen as unproductive. And as a result, you marginalize these women who often are supporting themselves either through necessity or through choice, through their herb lore. And so they instead get seen as witches. And she uses the play, The Tempest by Shakespeare, and the figure of Caliban, who represents indigenous cultures that Europe is coming into contact through with their projects of colonialization, and his mother, whose name I'm going to have to look at. It is Sycorax. I believe I have that correct, who is a witch. But the idea then of this tension between this traditional ecological knowledge and its tension and its dichotomy with this move towards the privatization of land. So what happens to the folks who forage if you chop down the forest in order to make grazing lands or industrialized agriculture? So this, she's exploring this sort of dichotomy and how that leads to this sort of devaluation of women's labor and results in a lot of gender-based violence. So I really recommend it for folks who are interested in looking at a kind of materialist as well as historical as well as interpretive history that really interweaves these kind of social science methodologies with feminist theories and economic theories, as well as looking at the art and primary sources of the time period. My next recommended book is Braiding, Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And what I love about this book is that it looks at this dichotomy of traditional ecological knowledge and scientific empiricism, and it says that's a false dichotomy. Kimmerer is a botanist, and she's works a lot in environmental sciences, and this book is really fantastic. It is, I think, what we all wish we could achieve with scientific communication, wherein her stories are very personal. She tells them in a relatable way. My favorite essay from this book is the Three Sisters crops. So she tells the story of the Three Sisters crops, which is a fantastic story wherein we have a corn, and the corn grows tall, and it creates this ballast for the beans to be able to vine, and the beans help to, improve the nitrogen in the soil. And then we have the squash, and the squash have these big leaves, and then they create this environment wherein all three of the crops together can thrive. And she talks about how when settlers came to North America and saw this type of gardening, were very confused as to, well, why don't you have the corn in one field and the beans in another field and the squash in another field? And that is really the way in which industrialized agriculture has sort of pointed us towards, and this issue of monocultures. And she really points to the fact that we need to think about ecology as the earth in balance, and how plants respond to their environment, and we need to sort of understand that through traditional ecological knowledge, and how it has so much valuation, and that wisdom is something that we can really benefit from in terms of science. And then also, it's just beautifully written. It's poetic. And so these stories are told in a very compelling and personal way. They still transmit this scientific as well as traditional ecological knowledge, and then plus it's just beautifully written. My next recommendation is Living a Feminist Life by Sara Ahmed. And this work really stems from her essay, A Feminist Killjoy, wherein she explores the figure of the feminist killjoy, who is someone who has to maintain the emotional energy to be continuously outraged and not lose the capacity for being outraged amidst a world where there are a lot of outrageous things that happen all the time. It has a feminist killjoy toolkit as well as a survival guide. One thing that I really love about her recommendation is the acknowledgement that the feminist killjoy is always seen as someone who is humorless, the one who cannot or will not get the joke, or the one who is miserable. Of course, we refuse to laugh at sexist jokes. We refuse to laugh at jokes when they are not funny. I consider this point to be so vital that it forms the fourth 10 principles of my Feminist Killjoy manifesto. But we do laugh, and feminist laughter can lighten our loads. In fact, we laugh often in recognition of the shared absurdity of this world, or just in recognition of this world. Sometimes we make jokes at a point left severed, the bleeding arteries of our institutional knowledge. Sometimes we laugh with each other because we recognize that we recognize the same power relationships. What I really appreciate about this text is that it speaks to a way in which you have to find a balance of living your principles, but still finding joy and humor in life. And I think that kind of segues into my next recommendation, which are collections of essays by Samantha Irby. So they're hers, We Are Never Meeting in Real Life, and Wow, No Thank You. And this is a bit of a cheat because I'm recommending them both with the same book slot. But Samantha Irby, I think, is possibly the funniest person on the planet. So I can't recommend her work enough. And I think she's a great example of someone who is using humor as a means of exploring the outrageous and the absurd. And I really think she does an amazing job of being able to balance using humor to navigate things like childhood trauma, as well as the experience of being a vulnerable person in a sometimes uncaring world. But she also balances that with this really hilarious, hyperbolic sense of humor, and finding a lot of high drama in the banality of the everyday. So we'll have like an essay wherein she is recalling the experience of her father's death, which is still told in this very dark, humorous sort of way. And then in the next chapter, we will have her list of all of the things that she will do in order to try to avoid having to go outside to socially interact with people, and their varying merits in terms of rationality. So very funny. So another principle of Sara Ahmed's feminist killjoy is that a killjoy is willing to cause unhappiness. A killjoy is willing to live with the consequences of what she is willing to endure. And she is willing to be the cause of someone else's unhappiness. And again, I think what's great about Sara Ahmed's writing is that she's very interested in how women's emotions become politicized, and the idea of women's excessive emotions as being something that shows weakness, or something that is a burden to others. And so this leads into my next recommendation, which is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado. And this is a collection of short stories. And what I love about her writing is that it really takes as its subject women's interiority in terms of like their desires and anxieties and emotions. And the writing itself is gorgeous, and the stories are thrilling. I really appreciate that Carmen is someone who has really embraced horror and fantasy as genres that can still receive the same kind of literary treatment that they deserve, to explore things like women's sublimated desires, as well as our vulnerability, the way women's emotions and desires are often stigmatized. And so the writing is fantastic. It's also very thrilling. And the cover image gives you this insight into what I think is the first story in the book, which, if you are a child of the 90s like myself, you will recall the scary story of the woman with the ribbon around her neck. And so it retells that story from the point of view of the woman, and what it means for women to be able to have boundaries and have those boundaries maintained and respected, but through a very scary and thrilling story. So again, the writing is fantastic, and I really appreciate that she deals with themes from fairy tales as well as horror stories, as well as Law and Order SVU, in a way that is very creative in terms of her narrative styles, and is also just really fun to read. So another book that I really love is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. And this book is also incredibly funny. And I have to say I was not expecting to fall in love with a book where the main character really finds so much fulfillment in working and from her job, but you love the character. And so the main character, Keiko, began work at the convenience store when she was 18, and she got it as a part-time job in college. But what she loves about the convenience store is that it is so logical how you should market particular products, when things need to be changed out. There's a rhythm and a structure that she really loves and finds stability from. And the world tells her these are not the things that a woman is supposed to find fulfilling. And of course, she has all of these pressures from her friends and family members. And she's someone who has the sort of clarity of mind that can make a lot of people feel a little unsettled, frankly. And so she's unsure how to sort of try to fit her personality into the ideas that other people have for what should be her life. And so this is really a story about don't let anyone ever tell you what you find fulfilling. When you find your fulfillment, make peace with that. And I have to read some of this. I have to do a little preamble because, like I said, she loves her job at the convenience store, but through the course of the novel has been convinced that she should apply herself elsewhere. And so this is after she has left working at the convenience store. I realized I was thirsty. Mechanically, I turned the faucet to fill my glass with water and drank it down. I suddenly recalled hearing once that water in a person's body was replaced every 2 weeks. It occurred to me that the water I used to buy every morning in the convenience store had already run through my body. The moisture in my skin, in the membrane over my eyeballs, was probably no longer formed by the water from the convenience store. And so she's convinced to sort of pursue a different life path, but in that pursuit she happens to stumble into a convenience store and she can't help herself. She starts, fixing the displays. I couldn't stop hearing the store telling me the way it wanted to be, what it needed. It was all flowing into me. It wasn't me speaking, it was the store. I was just channeling its revelations from on high. So it's a really funny book, and it's a great example of how nonconformity is a fulfillment in and of itself and a worthy pursuit and shows bravery. And don't let anyone tell you what makes you happy. So my thanks to the library for asking me to make these recommendations to share with you all. These books are available for checkout at our library if you want to check online in the library catalog or through your local public library. And I will say, in the case of Samantha Irby, she narrates her essays, so the audiobook is pretty fantastic. I hope you all enjoy a restorative as well as reflective Women's History Month this March.